To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support. The Destiny of Civilization: Finance Capitalism, Industrial Capitalism, or Socialism, by Michael Hudson. Foreword by Rentier. Humanity shares a common prospect: barbarism or ecological civilization. The most important factor affecting the global economy is the increasing strain caused by U.S. hegemony. Its diplomacy has shaped the economic and trading rules enforced by the IMF, World Bank, and other international institutions in America's favor after World War II. U.S. leadership reached its peak with the Cold War victory over the Soviet Union in 1991, consolidated by increasingly aggressive military diplomacy over the next 20 years. But since 2008, this U.S. diplomacy has become so aggressive that it is now self-destructive, driving other nations out of the U.S. orbit, leading America's international influence to fall increasingly short of its ambition to siphon off the world's income and wealth for itself, despite its own weakening economic power. The principal conflict in today's world is between the United States and China. This book, by Professor Hudson, explains this conflict as a process of international transformation, above all, in the sphere of economic systems and policy. He explains why the U.S. China conflict cannot simply be regarded as market competition between two industrial rivals. It is a broader conflict between different political economic systems, not only between capitalism and socialism as such, but between the logic of an industrial economy and that of a financialized rentier economy, increasingly dependent on foreign subsidy and exploitation as its own domestic economy shrivels. Professor Hudson endeavors to revive classical political economy in order to reverse the neoclassical counter-revolution. The essence of 19th century political economy was its conceptual framework of value, price, and rent theory. Its idea of a free market was one free from economic rent, defined as the excess of market price over intrinsic cost value, and hence unearned income. The classical aim was to free markets from landlords, monopolies, and creditors, yet the reverse has occurred in the West, particularly since the globalization of neoliberal policies in the 1980s. Historically, the way for industrial nations to gain wealth and power was to make their governments strong enough to prevent a landlord class from dominating, and indeed to suppress the rentier sector as a whole. To promote industrial prosperity, governments provided public services to reduce the costs of living and doing business. Basic services were provided at subsidized prices that would have been replaced by exploitative monopoly prices if key public infrastructure were turned over to private owners. Economically, the most important service that all economies need to function smoothly is the provision of money and bank credit. When privatized, it becomes a rent-extracting choke point. That is why 19th century economists, developing the logic of industrial capitalism, concluded that money and banking needed to be a public utility, so as to minimize financial overhead unnecessary for industrial production. Today's anti-classical economics regards financial charges as income earned productively by providing a service, which is categorized as output and hence part of gross domestic product, GDP. That statistical methodology treats financial profits, along with other forms of economic rent, as additions to GDP, not as an overhead burden. This produces an illusion that the real economy is growing. But what actually is growing is the rentier sector, which does not create real economic value, but merely transfers income from debtors, renters, and consumers to creditors, landlords, and monopolists. This rentier takeover is achieved by privatizing the public sector to create rent-extracting means for monopoly capital, organized mainly by the financial sector. This book by Professor Hudson is based on the lecture series on finance capitalism that he presented for the Global University for Sustainability. The series is directed towards the Chinese audience because he believes that China's mixed economy, with its classical industrial policy, has best succeeded in avoiding the neoliberal American disease. These lectures explain why the U.S. and other Western economies have lost their former momentum. A narrow rentier class has gained control and become the new central planner, using its power to drain income from increasingly indebted and high-cost labor and industry. The American disease of deindustrialization has resulted from the costs of industrial production being inflated by the economic rents extracted by this class under the system of financialized monopoly capitalism that now prevails throughout the West. The policy question for China is how it can best maintain its advantage and indeed avoid falling prey to American ideological and diplomatic pressure. Professor Hudson summarizes his prescription as follows. First, national statistics should distinguish the productive sectors that create real value from the financial rentier sectors that merely transfer income from the rest of the economy to themselves. A transfer payment is not production. Second, all successful economies have been mixed economies. Money and credit, land, public services, and natural resources should be controlled by the government so that they can be provided at cost or on a subsidized basis, thereby lowering the cost of living and doing business in the private sector. Third, the way to prevent unproductive debt overhead is to tax away economic rent so that it will not be financialized and paid out to banks as interest by speculators and buyers of rent-extracting opportunities. A central point of Professor Hudson's analysis is that U.S. diplomacy is an extension of the neoliberal ideology sponsored by its rentier oligarchy. U.S. exceptionalism means that the United States can ignore international laws, dictate the policies of other countries, and demand that they relinquish control of potential rent-yielding assets, such as banking, mineral resource extraction rights, and high-technology monopolies, to U.S. multinational corporations and those of U.S. economic satellites. For nearly the entire 75 years since World War II, pro-creditor laws have been imposed on all nations within the U.S. diplomatic orbit. This U.S. drive has imposed austerity on Global South countries when they have not been able to pay their dollarized debts, sacrificing their domestic economy and the well-being of their people to pay foreign bondholders. What is ironic is that the United States itself is by far the world's largest international debtor. It has turned the dollarized system of international payments into a way to make other countries finance its global military spending by making the foreign reserves of the world's central banks take the form of loans to the U.S. Treasury, holdings of U.S. Treasury securities, U.S. bank deposits, and other dollar-denominated assets. That is the buttress of today's debt-based dollar hegemony. To break out of this dollar trap, China should stand with other independent nations to develop a new system of international payments and formulate new principles of international law for trade and investment relations. These principles require an overall economic and political doctrine along the lines described in this book. What I find strange is that despite the West's economic, political, social, and cultural problems stemming from its neoliberal anti-classical ideology being obvious for many years, many people in China still look to Western schools and leaders for guidance, as if their own native institutions, civilization, and even their own race are inferior. The defeat of a country starts with the defeat of the people's self-confidence in its institutions. Yet as an American scholar, Professor Hudson, who has studied U.S. finance his entire life and worked on Wall Street for decades, recognizes China's institutional advantages. As long as we have the scientific spirit to continue self-reflection, self-correction, and self-enhancement, there is no reason not to believe that China's social organization and its ideology of common prosperity can lead its society toward a higher form of civilization. The key is to pursue our institutional advantages and abandon the shortcomings of the post-industrial Western rentier economies, not follow the Western neoliberal path and fall into dependency on the U.S. hegemony and ideology that has ground prosperity to a halt in most Western economies, subjected as they are to debt-ridden austerity. Behind today's finance capitalist crisis is thus a profound civilizational crisis. The world is at a crossroad in which all humanity now shares a common prospect: barbarism or ecological civilization. Wen Tie-jun, Executive Dean, Institute of Rural Reconstruction of China Southwest University, China. Translated by Alice Chan. Forward by Lao Ken-chi. How an Economist is Tempered, the Contributions of Michael Hudson to Humanity's Future. A favorite book of my generation was Nikolai Ostrovsky's 1936 novel, How the Steel Was Tempered, with the famous quote, "Man's dearest possession is life. It is given to him but once, and he must live it so as to feel no torturing regrets for wasted years, never know the burning shame of a mean and a petty past. So live that dying he might say, all my life, all my strength were given to the finest cause in all the world, the fight for the liberation of mankind." When I was young, I copied this in my diary to remind myself that every moment should be given to the fight for the liberation of mankind. Many friends of my generation were similarly affected. Starting to write the foreword to Michael Hudson's book, The Destiny of Civilization, this quote was the first thing that came to my mind. Having come to know Michael as a person and intellectual, working together intensely on his lectures and book projects, I find him to be dedicated, with a single mind, not wasting a moment of his life on less relevant matters. I saw from our back and forth email correspondence that he often sat writing for 15 hours a day, at the age of 82. This self-discipline stems, I believe, from an adamant will to give all his strength to the finest cause in the world. Economist on governing the world and caring for the people. Michael is a world-renowned economist. Here's what has been said about him. David Graeber, author of Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and co-organizer of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Michael Hudson is surely the most innovative and, in my view, the most important economic historian of the last half-century. There are few people alive who have taught me more than Michael Hudson. Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. Michael Hudson has consistently been an eloquent, erudite, accurate analyst of the strengths and failings of modern capitalism. He is one of the prescient few who anticipated today's never-ending economic crisis, and one of a smaller number still whose advice about how to end the crisis would actually work. Paul Craig Roberts, former Undersecretary of the U.S. Treasury, wrote on February 3, 2016 on Counterpunch, "Michael Hudson is the best economist in the world, indeed. I could almost say that he is the only economist in the world. Almost all of the rest are neoliberals, who are not economists but shills for financial interests. The above is no exaggeration. I would add that Michael is the world's best economist not only in professional expertise, but in moral rectitude, fighting for the liberation of mankind. By economist, I would invoke the meaning of the term economy as used in classical Chinese. The contemporary Chinese term economy, jingji, is derived from the term jingshiji used in the 4th to 6th century, literally meaning governing the world and caring for the people. This classical sense of the term is most appropriate to describe Michael as an economist, as he has been concerned not with the narrow workings of the status quo of market production and consumption, but with the way the world is governed and how people take care of themselves and are taken care of. His erudite concerns are presented in this book, aptly entitled The Destiny of Civilization. Eminent scholar and erudite writer. Michael is president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, ISLET, which he founded in the 1990s to coordinate a joint project with Harvard University's Peabody Museum to create an economic history of the Bronze Age Near East and to trace the transformation of economies in their political and social context over the past 5,000 years. Like all his work, this has not merely been about understanding the world. His prime motivation has been his endeavor to create a better and fairer world. One can imagine how a person of integrity, proposing genuine conceptual and practical alternatives to end polarized wealth and power, and above all, particularly intelligent and competent, would be a threat to corporate and financial interests, their state agents, media propagandists, and mainstream academia. Yet his analysis is so pragmatic and backed by statistics that despite the controversial nature of his critique of mainstream assumptions and theories, Michael remains widely respected for the dozen books he has written. His op-eds have been published in the Financial Times, New York Times, Washington Post, and major European papers, such as the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. His numerous cover stories for Harper's Magazine gained him international recognition for not only predicting in 2006 the imminent 2007-08 junk mortgage crisis, but also for diagramming the financial overhang that was causing the crash and leaving debt deflation in its wake, an analysis that he had earlier presented in articles and books published with his colleagues at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, UMKC, and at the Levy Institute at Bard College. He is a frequent guest on a broad range of TV and radio programs, including National Public Radio's Marketplace Reports, Democracy Now!, and numerous Russia TV shows. He is on the editorial board of Lapham's Quarterly, is a regular contributor to the e-blogs Naked Capitalism and Counterpunch, and maintains his own website at michael-hudson.com, providing access to his frequent public interviews and articles. Michael has had several books published in Chinese, with more coming soon, and is well known and respected in China. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has published numerous articles by him. He has been honorary professor at Huazhong University of Science and Technology in Wuhan, and a professor at the School of Marxist Studies at Peking University. I had read him long before we became acquainted. It was only in May 2016 that we met for the first time, in the company of Samir Amin. Samir and Michael were attending the First World Congress on Marxism held in Beijing. I introduced to Michael the work of the Global University for Sustainability, Global U, of which Samir and I were among the initiators. Michael gracefully accepted to become one of the founding members of the Global U. In May 2018, on the occasion when he, Samir, and David Harvey were invited as speakers at the Second World Congress on Marxism in Beijing, I interviewed him on his life and thought. I was struck by his demeanor of gentleness as a person and poignancy as a thinker. In the 1-hour interview, Michael told his story, which was simply amazing, explaining how his tempering as an economist is a combination of chance and the logic of the circumstances of his time. Between music and economics, modulation to a higher overtone key. Chance and contingency shape our lives. We might have seen Michael as a conductor and music theorist, which was his career aspiration as an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, studying for his B.A. in Germanic philology and the history of culture. At the same time, independently, he became the master student of Oswald Jonas, the collaborator of the German music theorist Heinrich Schenker, emphasizing counterpoint as driving the structural harmonic progression forward by dissonance resolving itself. To Michael, this unfolding of the overtone system by modulation to a higher key was a musical analog to the dynamic of social evolution. Michael's decision to shift to economics was dramatic. One evening, after moving to New York, planning to publish the works of Schenker, George Lukács, and others, he had dinner with Terence McCarthy, an Irish communist and translator of Karl Marx's Theories of Surplus Value. The conversation turned to how changes in water levels caused crop failures in the United States that led to an autumnal drain of money from the stock and bond market and hence to periodic financial crises. In Michael's words, "To me, these interconnections between production, finance, and the overall economy's systemic relationships were so beautiful, so aesthetic, in their unfolding, like musical counterpoint leading to modulation to a higher overtone key, that I decided on the spot to become an economist. Ever since," he says, "he has been able to achieve in his economic writing what he could not have created in music." Michael's first training followed his acceptance of the condition Terence McCarthy set to mentor him, that he would read all the works in the bibliography of Marx's Theories of Surplus Value. So, while taking his graduate degrees and working for Wall Street banks, Michael also worked part-time for the publisher Augustus Kelly to recommend and write introductions to reprints of economic classics. In the process, he acquired a library of books by economists missing from the normal history of economic thought. Childhood and teenage experience in an adversarial position. Michael's disposition certainly has a lot to do with his family and social background during his formative years. He was born in March 1939 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, into a family of labor activists. Of all the cities in the world, Minneapolis had the strongest Trotskyist influence. Michael's father, Carlos Hudson, had worked with Leon Trotsky in Mexico and had been one of the leaders of the great Minneapolis General Strike of 1934 as editor of the Northwest Organizer. His father loved Huckleberry Finn, and Michael was called Huck by family and friends, but since his father's party name was Jack Ranger, Michael, as a boy, also was nicknamed the Son of the Lone Ranger. When Michael was 3 years old, Carlos Hudson was jailed under the Smith Act as one of the Minneapolis 17. Carlos remarked that his year in prison was the happiest time of his life, being assigned to the library, where he collected a long list of proverbs that Michael reproduced on his blog in June 2017. Reading Dad's many proverbs, one might come to see not only how J is for Junk economics came to be structured, but also where Michael's remarkable sense of humor and witty comments can be traced. When he was growing up in Chicago, visitors to his house included former German colleagues of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and members of the Third International when Lenin was still alive and in power. There was almost constant discussion of socialist doctrine and tactics in the meetings convened in his home. When Michael was 14 years old, in the University of Chicago's high school, he was called a fascist by Stalinists and a communist by fascists. He told me, "I was very happy being in an adversarial position, yet also the reasonable voice avoiding ideology. I liked being hated by the right wing because it made me a lot of friends, and I recruited many members into the socialist youth groups in Chicago. Getting more confident and stronger when put in an adversarial position probably has been one of the key traits of his life. Michael has never accepted the world as it is, with its frauds, hypocrisy, and injustice, yet it has taken more than self-confidence and a strong spine to become the great economist that he is today. One reason for his brilliance and uniqueness is that he has not been swayed by his academic training in the unrealistic theories of the economics schools in the universities that justify rather than critically challenge the status quo. Michael has developed his analytic ideas through his real-life work experience in many countries, combined with his deep understanding of the history of economic thought. Wall Street Bank Experience, Countering Ideology. While employed by Wall Street banks as a statistical economist to understand how the financialized economy works, Michael studied for a master's and then a PhD degree in economics at New York University. According to him, most teachers in the master's program at NYU were part-time. The relatively few full-time academics had no experience working in a bank or corporation. Their worldview came from textbooks. Michael fortunately found out for himself how the banks worked, starting as a statistical analyst for the Savings Bank Trust for 3 years, and then as balance of payments economist for the Chase Manhattan Bank from 1964 to 1967. Initially, Michael's job was to trace how savings were recycled into new mortgage loans by New York's savings banks. His research showed that most deposits grew not by new saving, but simply by the accrual of dividends at compound interest. This exponential growth was recycled into new mortgage loans to buyers of real estate, seeking ever larger debt-equity ratios in order to dispose of the surplus finance capital. He saw that commercial banks did not lend money to finance new industrial capital investment, but only lent against existing assets, seeking above all to turn their profits or rents into a flow of interest payments. In short, rents were for paying interest, and increasingly today, so are wages. Because payments on bank loans, mortgage loans, and student debt and credit card debt eat away at the disposable income of most families. This is the monthly nut that households pay to the finance, insurance, and real estate, fire, sector off the top of their paychecks. Later at Chase Manhattan, Michael compiled statistics to trace how the export earnings of foreign countries were captured into paying debt service. He also traced statistically how U.S. oil companies made profits by transfer pricing, selling crude oil production cheaply to tax-free non-countries such as Liberia or Panama that used U.S. currency. The oil was then resold to refineries in Europe and the USA at a markup so high that oil companies had no profits to report and hence paid no income tax anywhere on their international and domestic operations. To U.S. policymakers, this exploitation was a success story. In 1966, the oil industry had copies of Michael's report placed on the desk of every senator and representative, and obtained special favoritism as a result of the sector's strong contribution to the U.S. balance of payments during the Vietnam War years. The conflict between this reality and academic orthodoxy struck him in 1968, when he had to retake the money and banking part of his PhD orals, because his answers were based on his real-world monetary and financial experience, which was at odds with the Chicago school monetarism and vulgarized Keynesian liberalism that had become the academic norm. That was an era when textbooks still taught of helicopters dropping money on the economy, not acknowledging the principle that Michael has made at many monetary conferences ever since. The central bank's helicopter only flies over Wall Street. Money from this helicopter is lent out to buyers of real estate, stocks and bonds, and to corporate raiders, with little being spent on goods and services. So, the effect is asset price inflation, which Michael has shown leads to debt deflation, as homeowners need to borrow higher and higher mortgage loans to afford the debt-inflated cost of housing, leaving them with less to spend on real goods and services. This now obvious linkage between rising housing costs and debt deflation was deemed heresy in the 1960s. Mainstream economists thought that as families became wealthier homeowners, they would have more to spend, ignoring the debt dimension of how homes were bought on credit that steadily pushed up the cost of obtaining housing. The finance, insurance, and real estate fire sector was and still is treated as if its rentier income should be added to the economy's output instead of siphoning it off. Economic historian, delving into the origins of money and debt. Michael's experience on Wall Street inspired him to set about investigating the origins of money and replacing the individualistic theories of its origin with a more realistic and historically based explanation. His technical articles and monographs are now accepted as documenting how money originated, not in barter among individuals, but as a means of palatial accounting in Bronze Age Mesopotamia, above all, to denominate debts owed to the palace, temples, and other creditors in grain and silver as common denominators whose units were set as having equal value for fiscal payments to the palace. Michael also has shown that instead of interest being invented by individuals lending cattle or grain to reflect productivity rates, as Austrian theory imagines, early interest rates were set by the palaces or other civic authorities simply on the basis of ease of accounting in terms of the local system of fractions, 60ths in Mesopotamia and Egypt, decimals in Egypt and Greece, and the 12-based duodecimal system in Rome, 1 troy ounce on the pound per year, increasingly decimalized into 1% per month. Finally, he has applied this historical analysis to modern times by showing that throughout history, debts have grown at compound interest faster than the economy is able to pay, leading to foreclosures and economic polarization if the debts are not canceled. Indeed, for this reason, personal debts were canceled when new rulers took the throne in Sumer, Babylonia, Egypt, and their neighboring lands, in contrast to Greek and Roman oligarchic opposition to debt cancellation and imposition of pro-creditor laws. Michael's insights into the workings of modern financialized rent-seeking economies both within the United States and globally have prompted him to conduct years of research not only into the origins of money and accounting, but into the origins of labor and how it was paid, the origins of land tenure and taxation, and the origins and history of debt. This analysis has led to his well-known proposition that debts that can't be paid won't be paid, and to his advocacy that unpayable debts should be canceled and can be canceled without causing economic disruption, and indeed that without doing so, economies will polarize and crash. At the World Social Forums, I had marched with tens of thousands of participants, including Samir Amin and Emanuel Wallerstein, with a banner whose slogan, "Don't owe, won't pay," demanded cancellation of debts for impoverished countries of the global south. However, I sometimes wondered if the slogan was chanted by many from a political position without a deep understanding of how the debts were generated. The slogan would be meek if it were only a political position to express the distress of the indebted countries and peoples, without an appreciation of why and how the debts should be canceled. Michael's advocacy of debt cancellation does not come from a simplistic political position, though certainly the proposition itself is profoundly political. The proposition comes from his insider knowledge of the operation of banks, oil companies, the government, and even the military. This experience informed his understanding of the domestic and global politics of the United States and of the financial dynamics of debt and the long history of debt cancellation in antiquity. exempt from academic dogmatism and left-wing infantilism, Michael's economic theories are based on decades of pragmatic statistical and historical inquiry, backed by his earlier training in cultural history, as well as his comprehensive reading of Marx's economic works. Staunch critic of U.S. super-imperialism. Working for the accounting firm Arthur Andersen, Michael spent a year analyzing the U.S. balance of payments. His statistics showed that the entire payments deficit resulted from military spending on the Vietnam War and elsewhere. Seeking ways to finance that military deficit led the U.S. government to ameliorate the worsening balance of payments deficit by asking U.S. banks to set up branches in offshore banking centers to attract the world's criminal capital, from drug dealings to kleptocratic embezzlement, the world's new neoliberal sectors. This outgrowth of oil industry flags of convenience has led to today's crisis of tax enclaves enabling the world's wealthy individuals and corporations to avoid taxation and file fictitious economic statistics. Michael has exposed this in numerous introductions to books and in interviews in documentary films. Michael's understanding of how the global economy under U.S. hegemony worked enabled him to forecast in Ramparts in 1968 that the USA would have to go off gold, which it indeed did in August 1971, explaining how ending the gold standard had inaugurated the U.S. Treasury bill standard that obliged foreign governments to finance the U.S. balance of payments and domestic budget deficits. His first book, Super-Imperialism, The Economic Strategy of American Empire, 1972, gained him international recognition and has been translated into many languages. He had hoped to help countries resist the system of dollarization that has enabled the United States to obtain a free ride for its foreign military spending and takeover of other economies. But from the very beginning, the U.S. government used the book as a how-to-do-it manual. Michael was quickly employed by Herman Kahn's Hudson Institute to explain to the White House and the Department of Defense how the new international financial order worked. The success of Michael's books led many Wall Street and Canadian financial institutions to retain him as a consultant forecasting interest rates and currency exchange rates. The Canadian government invited him as financial advisor to develop the balance of payments dimension of what has become modern monetary theory, MMT, showing that Canada did not need foreign loans to finance its provincial and other domestic spending. His book, describing why Canada did not need foreign borrowing for its provinces and companies to spend domestically, Canada in the New Monetary Order, 1978, showed that when Canada borrowed abroad, the central bank still had to create domestic money in any case to be spent locally as a counterpart to the foreign currency inflow. Hardly by surprise, this led to passionate attacks by Canada's banks, seeking to profiteer by indebting the economy through their loan underwriting. But it also led to further contracts with Canada's State Department and Science Council. In the late 1970s, Michael was invited by the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, to become economic advisor on North-South debt and trade. He warned of the coming Latin American debt defaults, which indeed began in 1982 with Mexico. He subsequently has served as economic advisor to numerous governments, agencies, and political parties, from Latvia to Greece. He has argued for national protectionism and capital controls to resist free trade imperialism, for domestic money creation to finance domestic spending on less inflationary terms than borrowing foreign currency, and for the need to tax and limit rentier gains in real estate and finance. Academic and theoretical contributions. Michael has worked within academia on sustained intellectual inquiry. For many years, he was on the economics faculty of the University of Missouri at Kansas City, UMKC, which became the center of MMT in the early 2000s with Randall Wray, Stephanie Kelton, and Bill Black. He was economic research director at the Riga Graduate School of Law, RGSL, where he became chief of the Committee of Experts for the Renewal Task Force Latvia, rtfl.lv. As for his most well-known academic inquiry, that into the history of debt and money, he was appointed a research fellow in Babylonian economics at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, where he organized a colloquium every few years from 1994 onward. The 5 volumes of conference colloquia that he has co-edited have rewritten the economic history of the ancient Near East and classical antiquity. These colloquia were on privatization, land tenure, and real estate ownership, which were found to be based on fiscal liability, debt cancellation and economic renewal, the origins of money and accounting, and the origins of labor services, discovered to have arisen to work on public infrastructure and to work off personal debts. The findings of these colloquia and their members refute previous libertarian individualistic theorizing on economic origins and have now become the new orthodoxy among Assyriologists, Egyptologists, and anthropologists, most notably Michael's friend David Graeber, who wrote his book Debt, The First 5,000 Years, largely to popularize Michael's approach. The essential focus of the colloquium volumes is on how money, interest-bearing debt, and land tenure were innovated in the palaces and temples of the ancient Near East, and on how the privatization of money and credit led to the polarization in ownership of land and other wealth in the hands of private oligarchies from classical antiquity to today's Western economies. As one of the few economists who predicted the 2008 crash, Michael published one of his most important theoretical papers in 2006, Saving, Asset Price Inflation, and Debt-Induced Deflation, in L. Randall Wray and Michael Forstater, editors Money, Finance, Instability, and Stabilization Policy, Cheltenham, 2006, pages 104 to 124. It accurately explained how the exponential expansion of credit created corresponding debt that would lead to the impending financial crash and its aftermath. On September 8, 2009, Dirk Bessemer wrote an article, Why Some Economists Could See It Coming, in the Financial Times, which stated that Michael Hudson of the University of Missouri wrote in 2006 that debt deflation will shrink the real economy, drive down real wages, and push our debt-ridden economy into Japan-style stagnation or worse. Importantly, these and other analysts not only foresaw and timed the end of the credit boom, but also perceived this would inevitably produce recession in the U.S. That article included the set of charts that helped make Michael famous for his explanation of why financial crises are endemic and lead to secular stagnation. Quote, Today, with the world in deep financial crisis, Michael has reiterated his proposition that unpayable or odious debts should be canceled, and indeed must be canceled, in order to avoid a global austerity crisis and economic polarization stemming from chronic debt deflation. One point of clarification here. The United States has become the world's biggest debtor mainly as a byproduct of the fact that most international debts are denominated in dollars. This poses a basic question: which debts should be wiped out? Michael urges that the debts of over-indebted households and impoverished countries in the global south should be written down, but that one debt should not be canceled: the official foreign debt of the U.S. government. The United States has run up this official foreign debt like its domestic treasury debt without expecting ever to actually pay it off. It has no intention of imposing on itself the austerity that it and the IMF demand of other debtor countries. This asymmetry, along with the U.S. sponsorship of today's new Cold War, has led leading dollar-holding nations such as China and Russia to begin de-dollarizing their economies. This signals the fracturing of the world economy that Michael predicted in his 1977 global fracture. the United States is forcing other countries to choose between accepting a dollarized and militarized rentier austerity or going their own way by creating mixed public-private growth-oriented economies. End quote. For socialism. For us on the Global U team, it has been a great privilege and honor to be learning from Michael face to face. He was invited to give lectures in Hong Kong and Macau in November 2019, during which he had a dialogue with Wen Tiejun on economic and financial issues in China. During the 7th and 8th South-South Forums on Sustainability in 2020 and 2021, he had further discussions with Wen Tiejun. Michael has a particular concern for China's development, as he feels that China is the leading exception to the U.S.-based neoliberal economic model, not taking the destructive advice of the IMF and World Bank. He has argued that China's economy can be resilient if it organizes its real estate, debt, and a tax system to avoid the rentier financialization process that is destroying the West. In September 2020, while we were chatting online, I sounded the idea that Michael give a lecture series for Global U. Michael accepted on the spot. I emailed him a proposal of 10 topics, and within 5 hours he came back with a detailed outline. The lectures were delivered weekly in September through December 2020. Rewriting these lectures to create the current book took another few months. I sometimes wonder whether Michael would have had second thoughts if he had known that his spontaneous acceptance of my request would take 10 months of his time. But fortunately for readers, this became a blessed opportunity to access his central ideas and be guided to his dozen books. The videoed lectures, subtitled in Chinese and divided into 70 episodes, were screened in April through August 2021 in China. The first episode has been watched by over 188,000 viewers, with 30,000 viewers on average for the remaining episodes. The English subtitled lectures are available on www.michael-hudson.com. What readers now hold in their hand, the book written on the basis of these lectures, presents Michael's dissection of the burning global issues of today, and his explanation of how the industrial capitalism, analyzed in the 19th century by Marx and other classical economists, has turned into finance capitalism based on debt and rent extraction. This financialized system is polarizing the Western economies and threatening their collapse in a wave of foreclosures and new privatizations by a financial oligarchy. Most important are Michael's proposed alternatives for de-dollarization and deprivatization to avoid global debt deflation and new Cold War imperialism. Indeed, if civilization is to avoid the destiny of destruction, if humanity is to have a future, socialism is the only way, and that is what Michael has passionately argued in this book. Lau Ken-Chi, Director, Executive Team, Global University for Sustainability Coordinator, Program on Cultures of Sustainability, Center for Cultural Research and Development, Lingnan University, Hong Kong, China. Preface. This book started as a series of lectures in October 2020 on the political economy of globalization and the logic guiding China, Russia, and other countries to break free of U.S. dollar diplomacy. These lectures were sponsored by the Global University for Sustainability as part of its South-South Dialogue Master Series. The discussion was led by Ken-Chi Lau and included Erebus Wang, Sui Sit, and Tung Yi Ko. All are on the faculty of Lingnan University's Center for Cultural Research and Development in Hong Kong, or are associated with it. Ashley Damon in Australia also participated, and has been remarkably helpful in discussing and copy editing my lectures. Other support came from the Green Ground Ecotech Center in Beijing and the Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, ARENA, Hong Kong. The discussion quickly came to focus on the difference between today's finance capitalism and the industrial capitalism described by 19th century classical economists. The historical task of industrial capitalism and classical political economy was to free economies from the hereditary landlord class and predatory, usurious finance. That seemed to be occurring from the late 19th century to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. But instead of progress into what was considered to be modern a century ago, the rentier interests have reasserted themselves. Their neoliberal ideology inverts the classical idea of a free market from one free from economic rent to one free for the rentier classes to extract rent and gain dominance. In contrast to classical political economy, their ideology promotes tax favoritism for rentiers, privatization, financialization, and deregulation. U.S. foreign policy seeks to extend this neoliberal rentier program throughout the world, mainly for the benefit of Wall Street, the City of London, Frankfurt, the Paris Bourse, and other financial centers. That effort is at the core of today's global fracturing. The resulting dynamics of financialization and debt deflation are polarizing and, as such, are antithetical to widespread industrial prosperity. The leading beneficiary of neoliberal ideology is the finance, insurance, and real estate FIRE sector. That sector is based on the symbiosis of finance and real estate. Rent extraction by that sector, along with the extraction of natural resource rents from oil and mining, and the monopoly rents resulting from the privatization of public enterprises, has become the central dynamic of the finance capitalism that has expanded to overpower industrial capitalism since World War I. The central role played by mortgage debt is largely the result of land and home ownership being democratized on credit. Owner-occupied housing has replaced tenancy to a hereditary absentee landlord class living off ground rents, but rent is still being paid to the banks, whose main source of revenue is mortgage lending. A drastic phase change occurred with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the 1980s, with its privatizations, junk bonding of corporate industry, and dominant financial strategy of creating wealth by asset price inflation, capital gains. By 2000, this strategy had led to a merger of investment banking with commercial banking, opening the gates for junk mortgage lending, commercial bank fraud, speculation in financial and insurance derivatives, and a broad regulatory capture of government by the FIRE sector. These changes led America to seek gains financially, deindustrializing its economy by asset stripping, using corporate revenue for stock buybacks and dividend payouts instead of new capital investment, and offshoring its labor and production in an attempt to win the race to the bottom. U.S. financialization policy thus provides an object lesson in the economic dynamics that China and other nations need to avoid. Readers may forgive me for returning repeatedly to the above themes throughout these lectures. My aim is to emphasize the common denominators in today's financialized rentier economies, and to show how their polarizing financial dynamics have become universal, threatening China as well as the United States and Europe. End of preface. Introduction. Most forecasts of GDP and national income assume that existing trends will continue, with economic product and income growing exponentially at historical rates ad infinitum. But economic reality knows only one form of perpetual exponential growth, that of debt accruing at compound interest. Financial claims expand by mathematical principles independent of the economy's ability to pay. The real economy's growth tapers off as its circular flow of income between producers and consumers is drained by debt overhead charges. That is the phenomenon of debt deflation. The tendency for debts and savings to grow faster than the underlying economy imposes austerity on labor and industry, and polarizes the distribution of wealth, real estate, stocks, and bonds, much more than that of income. In due course, financial wealth politicizes itself, aiming to block governments from regulating and taxing creditors, large property owners, and monopolists. The task of today's neoliberal economics is to provide an ideological cover story to rationalize this opposition to public regulation and progressive taxation. What appears at first glance to be a libertarian ideology of minimal government turns out to be a capture of government by increasingly centralized financial interests. The result is an inherently anti-democratic power grab by the 1%. Neoliberal ideology diverts attention from the economy's polarizing dynamics. Neoliberal orthodoxy aims to deter governments from public regulation, as if the major problem is not the rentier sector's debt and rent overhead, but governments strong enough to prevent predatory rent extraction. Today's national income and GDP statistics depict the finance, insurance, and real estate, fire sector, and extraction of economic rent from land, natural resources, monopolies, and banking as productive, not as overhead, to be minimized. Government intervention is deemed unnecessary by assuming the operation of supposedly natural tendencies for economies to settle automatically at a stable equilibrium, with wealth and income becoming more fairly and equally distributed, internationally as well as nationally. This fiction is necessary to support the claim that governments should step aside and refrain from interfering with free markets. The reality is that neoliberal free markets and free trade concentrate wealth and income in the hands of creditors and other rentiers, polarizing economies domestically and indeed internationally. Wealth addiction as a polarizing dynamic. The most fatal error that any theory can make is to get the direction of change wrong. But that is what today's mainstream economics does. Its notion of consumer choice assumes diminishing marginal utility based on the tried observation that as consumers are satiated with food, each additional mouthful gives less pleasure, utility. So demand is supposed to fall with increasing supply. A subtle sleight of hand then uses food and other consumables as a proxy for wealth, as if the only purpose of obtaining wealth is to buy consumer goods. The implication is that the richest individuals will become satiated with their wealth and leave more eager and hungry newcomers to strive to earn more and catch up. But Plato, Aristotle, and indeed most classical Greek philosophers, poets, and dramatists recognized that wealth is addictive and that creditor demands threaten to disrupt social balance. In their view, the more money one has, the more its possessor falls prone to a money lust for more. Money and power are not like a diet of bananas making one quickly satiated. Once addicted, one never has enough. And wealth addiction leads to a hubristic use of economic power to gain control of government and use it to facilitate greed and patronage power over clients, debtors, and renters. That is the history of classical Greek, Roman, and modern oligarchies in a nutshell. The abstinence theory of interest implies that the richest individuals are not greedy but are patient in foregoing consumption and making or financing a productive sacrifice to make their wealth. Recipients of interest are depicted as playing a productive role helping economies grow, but most lending today, and indeed historically, has not been for productive purposes. And most wealth has not been gained by hard work as much as by the rentier privileges that go with one's inherited status and assets. If non-consumption was the key to wealth, starving people would be the richest. Mainstream theory also ignores the limited range of choice that confronts most non-affluent people. Consumer spending is depicted as being open to choice, whether to consume now or save up for the future, earning interest, which is seen as a reward for abstaining from consumption. There is no acknowledgement of interest as a form of economic rent obtained by inheritance or privilege, nor that the indebted poor need to pay interest or rent as a condition of survival for basic needs. Your money or your life is the choice that in reality accounts for most consumer spending. Headed by housing, education, healthcare, and emergencies. Marginalism and centrist politics ignore the structural causes of inequality. Looking at small changes occurring in a given economic and political environment, marginalism focuses on income, consumer spending, and investment in the short run, not on the direction in which property and debt relations are moving. Lacking the concepts of wealth addiction, predatory lending, and the mathematics of compound interest, marginalist economic theory does not acknowledge that without public checks and balances, economies will polarize as wealthy elites use their power to impoverish the non-rentier sectors. Like marginalism, centrist politics only recognizes problems that can be resolved without challenging the status quo and its vested interests. Centrism assumes that however much the economy is polarizing, life can go on without systemic institutional change. This policy passivity ignores the tendency of economies to polarize as imbalances mount up, imbalances that are largely financial in character, with the FIRE sector's exponential growth of debt being their primary cause. Centrists view the economy as if automatic stabilizers will return life to normal growth in due course, but nothing marginal can save economies from polarizing as a widening swath of the population becomes more indebted while wealth is monopolized. Assuming that all debts can and should be paid, this centrism opposes reforms that would block the financial sector from indebting the economy and then monopolizing it as defaulters forfeit their homes and businesses. And when indebted cities and states suffer declining tax revenues and budget deficits as a result of debt deflation and economic polarization, they are told to cut back public spending, borrow or sell off public property and infrastructure rights. The effect is to increase the financial sector's power. Free trade imperialism and that of U.S.-centered finance capital. 50 years ago, in 1969, I started lecturing graduate economics students at New York's New School on the theories of trade development and foreign debt. Footnote: Trade development and foreign debt, a history of theories of polarization versus convergence in the world economy. New edition, Dresden, 2010. Chinese translation, Beijing, 2012. End of footnote. From the outset, I found a serious problem. If I taught the mainstream trade theory that appeared in the standard textbooks, it was not realistic. If I taught how trade and investment work in reality, it would be the opposite of what the textbook models taught and still teach. A perhaps apocryphal story about an American evangelist expressed the problem. Taunted about his illiteracy, he replied, "What is the sense of knowing such a lot if what you know isn't so?" Mainstream theory assumes production functions to be subject to diminishing returns. Yet the reality is increasing returns thanks to the progress of technology in industry, agriculture, and commerce. That perception was the essence of the American School of Political Economy in the 19th century, and of Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction by innovative firms employing new technology to cut costs and thus undersell existing producers. It is one of the principles guiding China's economic rise. Without tariff protection, production subsidies, and related government support, many countries will be unable to develop their industry and agriculture and move toward self-sufficiency in essentials by investing to modernize their technology, and therefore will remain dependent on trade patterns and credit dominated by the lead nations. If China had followed mainstream orthodoxy, it would have left its industry and agriculture to market forces, meaning the existing productivity gaps. The market would have left it with rising trade dependency and hence dollar dependency on U.S. banks and international organizations. That is the policy that the United States and other industrial creditor nations would like all countries to follow. instead of funding their own industry and agriculture to become self-sufficient. The reality is that international productivity and income gaps widen with increasing returns to scale and rising creditor power benefiting the lead nations. The counterpart to the widening advantage of these nations is obsolescence, for economies not keeping pace with improvements in productivity. Free trade theory is a rationale to justify such widening gaps and the resulting trade and financial dependency as the most efficient development policy. But instead of describing how Britain, the United States, and Germany industrialized and gained world leadership by protecting their industries in the 19th and early 20th centuries, neoliberal free trade ideology hypothesizes a what-if world. The so-called gains from free trade from buying lower-priced goods abroad actually measure the degree of trade dependency resulting from wage and productivity gaps. The drive by the United States to impose debt and trade dependency is the essence of today's new Cold War, shaped by active and often violent U.S. diplomacy. Charlie Wilson's famous phrase, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country," has been transmuted into "What's good for Wall Street is good for America." When merged with evangelistic U.S. foreign policy, what's good for America is good for the world, the logical syllogism is clear. What's good for Wall Street is good for the world. Dealing with financial polarization requires systemic across-the-board reforms. Social systems are different from individuals acting by themselves. Changing a social system requires systemic across-the-board reforms, not merely marginal changes. Creating a post-rentier economy requires debt write-downs, tax reform falling on economic rents, and public infrastructure investment to prevent monopoly rent seeking. These changes in property relations are necessarily systemic and require complementary monetary and legal reforms to retain stability over time. Such systemic changes must be coordinated. They cannot be introduced piece by piece at different times. This is what makes real reform revolutionary. Mainstream economics throws up its hands at this point and says that structural problems are exogenous, that is, outside the scope of marginalist models. Garbed in convoluted mathematics to deter the public from seeing their silliness, these models impose a tunnel vision to avoid describing the real world's debt and property dynamics. By not recognizing the polarizing forces at play, these models frustrate recognition of many necessary public policy reforms. A nation's economic path is not predetermined but is subject to active policy decisions. That is why classical economists called their discipline political economy. The political context is shaped not only by reformers but also by their rentier adversaries, because structural reform does not occur without the vested interests fighting back. In the international sphere, where the U.S. dollar is used as the major world currency under the Treasury bill standard, the United States resists attempts by trade-dependent countries and dollar debtors to create a less exploitative and polarizing diplomacy, threatening reformers with color revolutions and regime change. U.S. policy has been to install dictatorships and client oligarchies, praised as part of the free world democracy and rules-based order, as long as they support the neoliberal Washington consensus. Rejecting the dollar standard and the finance capitalist dynamic behind it requires an alternative economy organized to avoid privatization of economic rent and predatory finance. The starting point must be to recognize the distinction between earned income, wages and profits, and unearned overhead income, economic rent. It must also recognize how finance capitalism has gained power over industrial economies, above all in the United States, from which it seeks to project itself globally. Led by the financialized U.S. economy, today's new Cold War is a fight to impose rentier-based finance capitalism on the entire world. That requires blocking foreign economic reform. Chapter 1 explains industrial capitalism's 19th century aim to free economies from rent-seeking, and how this reform program failed to be realized after World War I, leading to finance capitalism instead of socialism. Chapter 2 describes how finance capitalism has inverted the moral philosophy that underpinned classical economics and its concept of free markets, with mainstream economic ideology now defending rentiers instead of seeking to end their economic and political dominance. Chapter 3 traces how this counter-revolution has internationalized itself to create a cosmopolitan financial oligarchy whose business plan involves reducing most of the planet to debt and trade dependency. To explain the dynamics at work, Chapter 4 reviews the classical concept of economic rent as unearned income and the result of privilege. Chapter 5 describes how the post-feudal landlord aristocracies that ruled Europe have metamorphosed into today's financial oligarchies, whose income and wealth remain based on rent extraction from assets financed by interest-bearing debt. The effect is to transform rent into a flow of interest payments. Chapter 6 places these dynamics in their international context. Free trade opposes government tariffs and actions to support industry and uplift the status and welfare of labor. Chapter 7 describes the most egregious attempts to block the authority of governments to protect their economies from social and environmental destruction, reviewing how these destabilizing and polarizing economic dynamics have politicized themselves. Chapter 8 describes how the threat by democratic politics to legislate reforms has been countered by party politics to prevent moves to create economic democracy. Chapter 9 elaborates how the rentier interests have consolidated their control of government despite nominal democratic politics, this having occurred most thoroughly in the United States with its oligarchic two-party duopoly. Chapter 10 describes the extent to which U.S. diplomacy has succeeded in making foreign countries keep their central bank savings in the form of loans to the U.S. Treasury, thereby financing America's military spending that remains the major cause of the U.S. balance of payments and domestic government budget deficits. Chapter 11 examines how U.S. neoliberal advice led the former Soviet Union to deindustrialize, and how the aim of neoliberal ideology is to turn public enterprises and utilities into rent-yielding financial vehicles. The world does not have to follow this path. Chapter 12 reviews the classical concepts of value and rent that were intended to guide policymakers in creating a tax and regulatory system to minimize unearned income in the mixed economies toward which industrial capitalism seemed to be evolving in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The concluding Chapter 13 summarizes why a financialized and privatized economy is incompatible with economic growth and rising prosperity for most of the population. It contrasts the economic program of industrial capitalism and its seeming evolution towards socialism with the finance capitalism that has emerged and gained momentum since the 1980s to monopolize economic growth in the hands of the top 1% of the population, with the remainder of the top 5% being given more modest opportunities for their role as cheerleaders and enablers. Only a radical across-the-board reform can reverse the Western world's polarizing trends and dependency relationships. That is what makes today's new Cold War so critical in determining the future course of world evolution and avoiding a Roman-style economic and demographic collapse. End of introduction.